By our best enemies do we not want to be spared, nor by those neither whom we love from the very heart. So let me tell you the truth, my brethren in war. I love you from the very heart. I am and was ever your counterpart, and I am also your best enemy. So let me tell you the truth. I know the hatred and envy of your hearts. You are not great enough not to know hatred and envy. Then be great enough not to be ashamed of them. Hello, and welcome to Golden Ashes, episode 2. Tonight we're going to be tying together the second episode of the book club with Friedrich Nietzsche. The excerpt we just read was from chapter 10 of the Spoke Zarathustra, which is entitled War and Warriors. One of the best chapters in the book, if you ask me. So when we last spoke, we were kind of going over virtue ethics and Nietzsche's conception of where these ethics and virtues stem from. For Nietzsche, really these virtues are inborn. So what do we mean by that? Nietzsche believes that your virtues are parts of your character that are innate to who you are. These could be genetic on some level. Obviously, genetic theory wasn't around when Nietzsche was publishing, but really I think he would just take it as a justification for his view on personality. So genetics is one aspect of this. Also, for him, really, what he's talking about here is the passions. So in the excerpt we read, obviously he talks about hatred and envy and how you're not great enough to not know of hatred and envy. So at least don't be ashamed of them. And what he's saying here is that your hatred and envy, if utilized in the right way, there's no need to get rid of these aspects of yourself. You can integrate them, you can sublimate them, and you can use them as a means by which you exert your will on reality. And so you might look at, from myth, a figure like Lancelot, who engaged in an extramarital affair with Guinevere, Arthur's wife, and who in the original Arthurian cycle, it's this transgression of the moral value of the kingdom that leads to Lancelot's salvation. It redeems Lancelot. It pulls him out of a narcissistic frame of mind where he's only concerned about himself and he's only concerned about what he's doing in the world, and it gives him a perspective of love. And this is something that is directly outcropped from his passions. And it's this very juxtaposition of the passions and the virtues that Nietzsche talks about in chapter 13 of Zarathustra. And I quote, "And just look at these men, their eye saith it, they knoweth nothing better on earth than to lie with a woman. Filth is at the bottom of their souls, and alas, if their filth had still spirit in it. What that ye were perfect, at least as animals, but no animals belongeth to innocence. Do I counsel you to slay your instincts? I counsel you to innocence in your instincts. Do I counsel you to chastity? Chastity is a virtue with some, but with many it is almost a vice. These are continent to be sure, but doggish, and lust looketh enviously out of all that they do." So what he's saying here is, if you castrate your passions, you're still a slave to them. It's dialectical in the sense that where you have one passion and you've removed yourself from it entirely, you are going to be ever watchful for any chance at slip up. But rather, if this is something that you've mastered, if you've mastered your anger, if you've mastered your lust, if you've mastered insert thing you may be struggling with, then what you really have is an opportunity to use it for good. So anger, for example, typically you don't want to lash out in anger. You don't want to be uncontrollably flying into rages at every slight or perceived injustice. But there are good uses for anger. For example, God forbid, a home intruder. This is a great use of anger to protect your family, to protect yourself, to protect your home. Another great example of a mastered passion would be lust. You know, if you're married, bringing that spice maybe into the bedroom. I don't want to get too explicit, so we'll leave it at that. But using it in a romantic sense. You know, I don't think any wife would want her husband to be a totally chaste monk. That is not what most women or men have in mind when they enter into the marital covenant. So here we really start to piece together what a heroic life might look like. How, you know, you have someone like Napoleon, who for Nietzsche was very close to what he meant by the Übermensch, in the sense that he wasn't a slave to his passions, but he also wasn't a slave to self-denial. And I don't want to talk too much about Napoleon, and I also ironically don't want to talk too much about Nietzsche. We're really just trying to frame the conversation so that way we can get into a heroic life in really an anti-heroic age. And I've spoken in the past about how liberalism is anti-heroic and how the liberal age is anti-heroic and how it doesn't really know what to do with the heroic, and often what it ends up doing is subverting the heroic ideal in order to fight for liberal causes. So it uses these men as, you know, think of like someone like Chris Kyle, and so it uses these types of men to go and fight wars on behalf of the liberal empire, literally and figuratively. Now, it's also worth noting here that for Nietzsche, as well as other writers throughout history, you know, someone like Julius Evola comes to mind, Yukio Mishima, the path of self-mastery over denial is not something that's meant for everyone. There's a reason that your big tent religions don't focus on this for the average person. It's because, you know, the average person isn't capable of being a monk. They're not capable of being a great hero. They're not capable of being a king. And so what you have when you have these world-encompassing political or religious systems, they have to make sense for the common man, or the herd as Nietzsche typically calls them. Now, before we get too much further into it, I would like to kind of take a step back and explain why it's important that we frame our lives in this heroic mythos, and why, in the modern West at least, that is something that the establishment absolutely does not want for its young men to do. So we're going to take a look at Spengler for a minute and how he frames the civilizational cycles. And you do have a bit of the Nietzschean eternal return. So for those of you who may not know, Nietzsche, he sees his project as denying or demolishing metaphysics, all metaphysics that came before him. But he posits this idea that your life that you're living right now is something you are going to experience for all eternity. And it's part of his rejection of free will. But then you get into Spengler, and the civilizational cycle. So Spengler believes that civilizations, like people, are born, grow up, live, and die. And so for Spengler, the mechanism by which this happens is culture and civilization. We use that term or those terms synonymously a lot of the times today. Spengler did not use them synonymously. So Spengler views culture as the framework by which then civilizations canonize into law and then use that culture as an expression of power or power projection. Spengler famously read a lot of Nietzsche, speaks very highly of Nietzsche. And a great example of this would be the Greeks and the Romans. So for Spengler, the Greeks were the cultural phase and the Romans were the civilizational phase. Why that's important for us is because he frames the modern West as the Faustian West. And so this starts with the fall of Rome and really with Charlemagne. With Charlemagne, what you have is you have the seeds formed of equality before the law, we'll say. And in ancient pagan Europe and Greece, this was not something that they had. If you were a slave, you were a slave, and you weren't getting equality before the law. Like, there might be separate judicial processes for you, but by and large, the respect of governmental institutions wasn't something you were afforded. And the Spenglerian notion of Charlemagne. So Charlemagne opened schools for the peasantry. He thought that it was important for men to have literacy, to be able to read and write. And later this becomes with the Magna Carta and in the English Civil Wars, it becomes canonized into equality before the law. Hey, Mr. King, you are a person just like the rest of us, and if you pass a law, you have to follow it also. This then gets expanded during the Enlightenment and becomes canonized in the American and French revolutions, where you have, the notions of égalité, fraternité, equalité. And side note here, Julius Evola says that his principles are that every person born before the French Revolution was sane and rational. This is part of what he's talking about, is the enfranchisement of all of the populace. We'll get into Evola probably in a couple weeks. So why this is important, again, is because for Spengler, once you reach the civilizational cycle, once you've reached the civilizational phase of your society, you're not producing any new culture. So you can look around at, say, if you're in America, at Hollywood, how many things are just remakes or pulling from books, or no one has any original ideas. Most of the music on the radio at all, everyone's seen the same 4-chord meme. How many pop songs are written in the same key using the same 4 chords, just some variation upon that. It comes down to philosophy. You're not creating any new philosophies. You don't have anything by which you are expanding the consciousness of your populi. And so for us, our civilization really began with the American and the French revolutions. And so what you have during the civilizational phase is you have taking things to their extreme logical conclusions. The way Spengler kind of characterizes this is Marxism as an extreme logical conclusion view by a post-Christian Karl Marx. So you go from Christ and the early church saying everyone is equal before God, and then you have Charlemagne sowing the seeds of the Enlightenment, everyone is equal before the eyes of the law or before the eyes of the state. And then the final instantiation of this as an outcropping of the civilizational cycle would be Karl Marx saying all men are equal, full stop. And once you achieve this civilizational cycle, or once you're in this logical conclusion phase of the ideas and philosophies and religions of your civilization, Spengler notes that it's important to know that you can't return to any one specific point at any point during that process. So a great example of this would be Trad saying return. Spengler would look at that and say, return to what? And this is something you see with classical liberals where they're like, oh, Enlightenment values. Well, no one takes them serious anymore because we're so far gone from that as a society. You're never putting the cat back in the box, right? The toothpaste is never going back in the tube. And this is something that's important to note for those of us on the political right, because I see a lot of history, like the right almost has become a character of itself in that it's a cult of history. And obviously the left is a cult of the moment. It's a cult of the now. They lack little to no, they have little to no foresight. They don't respect their history. They don't respect their lineage. They don't respect any of that. But at the same time, that's all the right respects. If it doesn't have pedigree, the right kind of wants nothing to do with it. And I'm not talking about the GOP here. So it's important for those of us with a right-wing persuasion that what we're calling back to, that which we seek to draw inspiration from, is that it is an inspirational force by which we can use to create something new. This is something that Evola talks about in Ride the Tiger. Actually, it's on like the first 2 pages of Ride the Tiger, is that if a structure is decadent and decaying, it's more valuable to let it crumble so that way you can be in charge of what comes next. And that brings us to the heroic. So when we look at the imperial civilizational cycle through a Spenglerian lens, and there's other historians that have looked at civilizational cycles and view it outside of the linear, like there's 2 schools of thought when it comes to history. So there's the cyclical lens and then there's the linear progression. And our age, very materialistic, is one of linear progression. And Spengler, as well as several other historians, view the historical cycle as one of a cyclical nature, hence historical cycle. Some of these other thinkers include Toynbee, Gobineau. There's a really good book by Academic Agent called Prophets of Doom. Great introduction to historians and anthropologists and philosophers who have advanced a cyclical view of time, specifically in context to the civilizational cycle. However, we're not here to talk about those other thinkers. One of the key defining aspects that we see throughout history, you have a decadent and weak empire on the verge of collapse. And often what happens is there's a barbarian neighbor. For the Romans, this was the Goths. For the Greeks, this would have been the Scythians, as well as in some contexts, the Macedonians. The Macedonians had a monarchy which during the time of the Macedonians was seen as backwards. By this point, most of the city-states had taken on some form of democracy or oligarchy. And by the reign of Alexander the Great, a Grecian monarch or sovereign ruler would have been out of place. And also, Macedon wasn't really looked at through they weren't really included with Greece by people from the Grecian peninsula proper. And so, but they're closely related in terms of genetic makeup. And this is something you see also with the Romans and the Goths or the Vandals, or even the Gauls. And so what happens as the empire weakens is these barbarians fill the ranks of the empire, but they also come from without. And this is something that is unique to today, where we don't have classical barbarians. There's no closely related Western but not properly westernized brother nation to kind of come in and reinvigorate the imperial stock. So as these empires would collapse, the barbarian group that was coming from within would then kind of institute like a new alternative elite or alternative aristocracy. Often these were people who had been trained within the imperial system. Take someone like Arminius, great example. And we can talk about his story. Arminius lived during the Roman occupation of Germania, and during that time period, the Romans would take the firstborn son of every chieftain and send him back to Rome for a proper Roman education. And after this child had proved himself loyal to the Roman Empire, they would send him back to reintegrate with his tribe and rule kind of as a liaison between the tribe and Rome. Now, Arminius was highly decorated by the age of 16, went back to his tribe, and he consolidated with the tribes around him because he never really forgave Rome for what they had done to him, taking away his childhood and raising him in Rome. And he devised a plan of attack where he, after, again, consolidating these tribes, he sent back saying that these tribes were being hostile to him and he needed Roman reinforcements. So the one of the Roman generals, Quintilius Varus, I believe was his name, sent anywhere between 2 and 5 legions. I'm a little fuzzy on the actual historical numbers there. And for a while, what would happen once these legions crossed the border into Germany, the tribes would sing their tribal war chants at night and harass and hound them from a distance. And so you ended up having these Roman legions who were sleep deprived and terrified and utterly humiliated. And by the time the Germans attacked, by the time the Goths attacked, the Roman line broke. And I believe it was Tacitus who wrote that after this happened, Caesar Augustus wandered his halls for weeks, saying, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." And keep in mind, when we picture the idyllic Roman in our minds, we're seeing someone with blonde hair, blue eyes. These are people who immigrated who sailed from Greece after the fall of Troy, if the Aeneid can be taken as historical myth, meaning that it's myth that contains aspects of true history, which I believe that it can, and the genetic testing of these people groups support that. And you also find the same traits in the Germans. And so this is what I mean when we say we don't have anybody like this left. Clearly we have barbarians. We have no shortage of third world immigration, people who don't worship our God or gods, depending on where you fall in the religious question. They don't hold our morals, values, ethical systems. We have different concepts of art and aesthetics. We're not alike in any way, shape, or form. And so we have barbarians in that context, but we don't have barbarians in the sense that the Goths will swoop in, reinvigorate our political elites, and create something new from the ashes of what is currently collapsing. And so this is something that we have to do ourselves, not in the sense of like overthrowing our governments, but we have to reinvigorate our political ruling established elites either at a local, state, or federal level with this strong, heroic, barbaric kind of perspective on the world. And this really is the crux of what I'm getting at with the virtue ethics, with the Nietzschean concept of the Dionysian, or even with my own conceptualization of the inversion of the Dionysian and the Apollonian into its opposite principle as time moves forward. So where do we start? How is this re-barbarianizing going to occur? Well, if you look at birth rates in the West, specifically the United States where I live, because if England or France course corrects, that's great, and I'm happy for them, and I hope they do, but it doesn't affect me. Likewise, if America course corrects, it might not necessarily be beneficial for France or England, but as the current global hegemon, France or England will see downstream effects where the United States wouldn't necessarily, if this is something that kind of catalyzed in one of those two nations. So if you look at birth rates in the United States, they're declining, like everywhere. But the people who are having children are, for the most part, the people we want to be having children. Anecdotally, I can't tell you how many people I know that are ostensibly right-wing, religious, who have multiple children, homeschool, do all the right things. But I think one of the key characterizations here is in that upbringing, if you're someone who has children, you need to you really need to focus in and place a premium on ancestral legacy. Not for the purpose of becoming a cult of history like I'd spoken about previously, like I see that happening on the right wing so much, but because it's important for our children to know that they were handed down something, that people fought and bled and died to give their progeny a world that they created for their progeny. And we cannot allow that torch to extinguish on our watch, especially if you have children. I think the urgency in which you feel if you have children, as I do, I have children, and I know the urgency for me to create a world better than the world that they are currently growing up in is of the singular utmost importance to me. So you need to be placing a premium on their European heritage. Secondly, you want to make sure that you're not helicopter parenting. That's something that I've seen people talk about in terms of why Gen Z is so messed up, or even younger millennials, is there's no real places that are safe for children anymore, whether that's because of predatory adults or because we've just killed everything through consumerist mini malls and by turning the country into a glorified parking lot. There is wilderness, and this might be different depending on where you live, but exploratory space and giving them room to fail, to think outside the box on their own without running to an adult, is very important, because a lot of the problems that we have are going to require creativity. And lastly, if you have time or if you have money, getting involved in local politics, whether that's getting on some kind of board or Republican, or hell, even Democrat if you are Machiavellian enough, getting on some kind of board of local electoral process, running for office. Even if you don't win, it raises awareness. You can shift the Overton window and perhaps pave the way for someone who can make the arguments or understand the contextual frame by which your town or city or state kind of moves. And the other thing is creating culture. So this is something that Spengler and Nietzsche both place as a premium. If you have an artistic kind of frame of mind, at this point, you have a duty to create culture. In fact, I would say it's a dereliction of duty if you're not. So if you can writing novels, poetry, short stories, whatever it is, to put that out in the cultural zeitgeist, making music, whether that's classical, or I know there's a lot of like white nationalist rappers who are kind of coming out. So you have Saxon from New Zealand, and you have No Face Nate. Don't know where he's from. These guys are with the Will to Rise Active Club record label. And then going back to like the 2016 alt-right days, guys like Byron De La Vandal or Patty Tarleton, Mr. Bond, great examples. We don't necessarily need to be crass at this point. It should be more than about memeing, and it really should be about creating culture. So yeah, I think that is a really good place to end it. So just to recap, we talked about Nietzsche's conception of virtue and how it's inborn. There's a genetic component, and your virtues come from mastering your passions. How the Spenglerian civilizational cycles kind of place the West at its end point. This is something we may elaborate on further. And then how we as young Western men can re-barbarianize ourselves and our children to reinvigorate our ruling political elite or establishment, and how we can do a lot through cultural generation, through generating culture and the creative processes. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, anything you do in the modern age is through this kind of like hearts and minds lens. This is how we fight our wars. This is how we do our politics and our campaigning. And everyone on the left is pretty much devoid of creativity, which is why we see so many remakes and rehashes of everything. Fanfic, personal favorite of the left wing person. But it's not new. They're not creating anything. So really, and this also goes for academia. If you're someone who is involved in academics, as I am, I'm currently pursuing my master's degree in philosophy. I'm not going to say where for doxing reasons, but currently pursuing my master's degree in philosophy, and I know a lot of my papers tend to have a, we'll call it traditional slant, or a classical slant. It's better. And I cite people that have typically been not accepted by the mainstream academic flow of things. And this can be dangerous. I don't necessarily recommend doing it. It might be better to play the game and get through it where you can. But it's also important to make sure that while you have the feedback, that you're doing things to learn and grow in the direction you want to. And I've been blessed with very good professors, so I'm in a unique situation, I guess. But yeah, shifting, because this is like traditionalism, right-wing, reactionary thought. It's not cool in academia. A lot of these people are boomers, and so they're still coming from the 1960s, whatever. And they see traditionalism and they see reactionary right-wing thought as a, they see it as establishment. And that's, they associate Trump with the far right. I think it's safe to say at this point he's not. So really, for those of us coming up through the academic system now, the onus is on us to make reactionary thought cool again, because it's normal, right? All throughout history, the academics, Plato was a reactionary, Heraclitus was a reactionary, Nietzsche was a reactionary for sure. Mussolini was a political scientist. Fun fact, the United States has had one president with a PhD in political science, and that was Woodrow Wilson. So stay out of political science if you are going into college and listening to this, or maybe go into poli-sci and you can be the Arminius for that area of study. Who knows? But anyways, thank you for listening to Gold and Ashes, and I will see you next week.